development, and then they die, or maybe they die. We didn't know. So we had different considerations for their protection. Do we move them in the hatcheries? What about different hatcheries? Do we move them into Battle Creek? So we had all these things that we considered, certainly not the best for the species, but we had to try to take care of them. In February and March, we saw the rains come. Certainly not enough. We're still looking at 1.1 in Shasta. So we're still thinking about these other contingencies. And I would say Winter are not out of the woods. John's PowerPoint presentation, he talked about the current snowpack and snow melt. So we're looking into 2015 as kind of a dire situation for Winter Run, not just the amount of water, but the amount of cold water. And we thought about this throughout the season, or throughout the watersheds. We thought about this during the discussions for the American River and Folsom. Does it make sense for us, for the people in Folsom? We heard earlier some presentations and concerns about water supply. Does it make sense for us to have a pulse flow to provide for a steelhead? Do we provide for them now or hope for the best for the summer? Earlier, end of last week, we received a draft temperature management plan for the American River, and we're looking at 70 to 71 degrees. We require 65 degrees at Watt Avenue for the protection of rearing habitat for steelhead. 65 degrees at Watt Avenue, we're looking at releases at a nimbus that are greater than 65. So for us, it made sense for to us a little amount of water with, all due respect to the other users, about 2,000 acre-feet of water to provide for their needs, try to flush them out of the system for better habitat now, rather than the habitat they're going to be subjected to later. And I think later on, if you have any other questions, would be better off for you to just ask them than for me to ramble on.
Thank you.
Chairman Marcus, board members, it's a pleasure to be here. One of the nice things about going last is that most of the topics have been addressed, so I'm not going to go into detail. I think one of the things I want to do is highlight the participation of the board staff in the drought operations and in the planning for the drought operations plan. I think their participation has been particularly critical, I think, particularly as it related to the vernalis flow requirements and achieving, I think, a much better outcome there for the San Joaquin and helping with that process and working with the Bureau to achieve good conditions as best can be achieved in the Stanislaus system and coordinate that with other actions on the Tuolumne and the Merced to improve out-migration conditions. I think a point that Garwin highlighted is these issue of, inadequate temperatures below rim reservoirs, pointing to the American, but also same kind of situation in the San Joaquin system, particularly with the Merced. Having a pulse there to get fish out of the system was important because their potential for surviving later into the season due to temperatures and the ability to meet those temperature criteria is certainly questionable. I think it also has issues relative to hatchery operations in that, a number of our hatcheries are not going to be operating because of temperature concerns and the availability of cold water because they rely on what comes out of the reservoirs. So that's changed how we've managed our hatchery operations and will carry over into the future. I think an important point is also the balancing across water use, and I think, as Garwin pointed out, the foregoing of rice decomp will be an important measure, but that will also come with an effect on winter waterfowl and waterfowl habitat. So there are a number of balancing actions that have to be taken. We're also, particularly interested in the transfer program, but it also has issues relative to fallowing and effects on terrestrial species, particularly things like garter snakes, and balancing across the full range of potential drought effects that are facing us. The department certainly appreciates the cooperation that we've experienced with water contractors and our counterpart agencies in working in a collaborative way to develop the drought operations plan, which finally gets us on a fairly stable footing for the foreseeable future. We share your concerns about, how we look at 2015 and anticipate that, recognizing that, the drought operations plan attempts to meet kind of basic needs going forward if the worst case scenario prevails. But we continue to look at how that would be handled. Another issue for us is, and I think is shared by the board, is kind of the accounting process of how we've saved, how water has been managed and saved, and how it's going to be put to the various beneficial uses. And I think that's something that still needs to be worked on and better understood as we move forward. With that, I'll just end my comments and open it up to questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Without any judgment on the result, I just, from watching from the sidelines, I want to commend you all too for moving outside everyone's comfort zone. I think you've done more cross-training in each other's issue areas and interest in ways that I know from some of your stakeholders have resulted in arrows and brickbats for not just representing a particular need to the max and arguing it, but instead trying to figure out how to work together. And it's just been impressive to watch. So I want to thank, I know it's been painful at times, but I just want to thank you and your folks as people for taking the time to understand the concerns of your colleagues from other agencies and the interest that they represent in trying to find collective solutions. The effort hasn't gone unnoticed. It has, in our last drought workshops, it made some people very nervous. They didn't like it very much, but I actually have been impressed at watching people's efforts to stretch beyond just the silo of their particular authorities. So just want to thank you all for that. Questions? Start this way, this way? I'll start this way this time.
Okay, thanks. Thank you to the team and all your efforts to work together. Felicia said it so well. This was unprecedented need to collaborate. And I hear from your remarks, you've learned a lot. And I think that's what's important for all of us is to pay attention and learn and plan. So in that regard, one of the things that our staff put up, as far as what we were expecting with our order starting in January, was the efforts to collaborate and model, in which we saw some of the modeling runs and forecast it, but also to monitor. And I heard more informally, some results of the monitoring that's been done and how it's fed back to some operational decisions. But I didn't hear it so much in your remarks today, and I understand, some of that monitoring information, whether it's water quality, fisheries related, or water diversion data, and that sort of thing. Just the information we're collecting as part of our collaborative effort. I'd ask any or all of you to maybe give a highlight of how monitoring information, what's being collected, and how it's helped inform management decisions, or how you hope it will help management decisions, particularly as we look forward to 2015 and its challenges. So, monitoring.
I'll take a first shot in that, there are basic monitoring programs that are in place primarily through the Interagency Ecological Program. Those have continued and in some cases been expanded, particularly the Fish and Wildlife Service's Jersey Point early warning monitoring for Delta smelt. And I think that information, along with the intensified sampling related to the DCC operations, has provided kind of critical information on where fish are in the system and what the risk is. And that all of that information has played critically a critical role in how we've looked at operations and considered the changes that have been requested as part of the urgency changes and been incorporated in the drought operations plan.
Sometimes there's a timing issue about getting the data back, but it sounds to me like, you know, that's been a system that's been working for the team, that you've been looking at actual real-time data as you weigh different policy decisions.
Yeah, I just to put a cherry on top of Carl's remark, because I agree completely. It's been critical that we do this, and we have been working on some new approaches that are appropriate to drought conditions. The early warning sampling that we were doing for adult delta smelt at Jersey Point was only possible because of support from Bureau of Reclamation. I want to thank them for that. We also have been working on some outside-the-box approaches to assessing larval delta smelt entrainment risk that rely on methods that are new to this year and are really kind of special approach. We have spent a lot of time talking about monitoring because, among other things, in addition to needing to manage the effects of the drought, we also need to learn from it. Most of us have not seen a drought this deep in our careers, and given the number of gaps there are in our knowledge about how species respond to the drought and water operations, it's been critical that we do that kind of thinking.
Yeah, I want to echo what Carl was saying, and I was thinking that exact thing about monitoring for the DCC. As John's presentation had, the Delta Cross channel was open approximately February 1st to February 10th, but the request was whenever there's salinity issues. So we didn't know what that really meant. Is that 24/7 for 3 months? But we had to insert some kind of monitoring to ensure that winter run and all of our species in the Sacramento make it down safely in the main stem Sacramento River. So as far as monitoring for Delta Cross channel closures and openings, we really increased the expectation or requirement of monitoring to make sure that we can actually find the fish if they're there. There were issues. We're talking about spreading the pain, and everybody loses. The question is how much. We started getting into safety issues about boaters and monitoring equipment and folks going out there with less sleep and all. So I think all the 5 agencies allocated staff to go out on the boats to be able to help out with the trawls and the seines. But the increased monitoring and the timeliness of that. So for the Delta Cross channel or Knight's Landing, for example, in Tisdale, we required monitoring 24 hours a day. Frequency of the rotary screw trap checking to make sure that there's no increased take associated with the increased monitoring. And we get results back within maybe 6 hours. So 24 hours defined as up until midnight, we get those results first thing in the morning. And then when it looks like with projections and forecasts that it's not likely that the DCC will be open in the foreseeable future, however we define that, then we're able to relax some of that monitoring requirement. For this year, as a result of last year's annual review of operation of the both biological opinions, Fish and Wildlife Services and ours, the panelists recommended as far as temperature compliance for winter run needs, we asked for 56 degrees at a certain temperature compliance point. The question is, 56 to us looks like it's being met, but what do the eggs feel? Is it really 56 down in the reds? So there was a suggestion to monitor within the reds. So that's part of the winter run contingency plan and monitoring, is to actually put probes within reds down to where we think the eggs are, to take a look at the temperatures that they're exposed to, and also the diurnal fluctuations. And I mentioned last year with winter run and not wanting to dewater winter run reds, we asked Reclamation to maintain Keswick releases higher than they normally would in October. And one of the questions is, at what point would reds be dewatered, defined as rocks being exposed to the surface, and would that change any kind of relationship between the water and the temperature and the nutrients down in the reds? So that's part of the monitoring that we're going to do this year.
This is John again. So just to touch a little bit on the water quality aspect of monitoring. You know, water quality monitoring is always a big part of operations as it is. I think that just because of the extraordinary measures that have been taken this year, you know, related to DCC gate openings, those sorts of things, we've really made an extra effort to kind of bolster our tools that help us with that decision support. And so I think that you know, enhancing that monitoring capabilities this year will help us, such things as, you know, not have the cross-channel gates open any longer than we needed to, absolutely, for the benefit that it did provide during that period in late January, early February. Fortunately, we have not had to have the gates open since then. I think the water quality monitoring is also going to be key in just tracking how we go through the summer and helping inform as we go into next year if we have to, if we feel the need to implement the drought emergency rock barriers at some point. That monitoring is going to be crucial to helping with that decision support. So.
Probably fine-tuning the modeling that you do and that sort of thing.
Yes, and so, you know, it's really increased our coordination even within DWR, bringing in our experts of, you know, our Bay Delta office folks have been very instrumental in providing the support to really enhance our modeling capabilities and really hone in on you know, trying to conserve every drop that we have as we go through the summer and still maintain the adequate protection for water quality purposes.
Do you think also, you know, as you noted very well in your presentation, that you have to manage with a buffer? Do you think this enhanced monitoring and modeling will help you reduce that buffer maybe going forward in the future?
Yes, I think that's what we're really hoping to be able to, like I said, squeeze out every drop. Yep.
This is Ron. Probably just to add to that, there's obviously, as Mike pointed out, collecting data under a pretty rare event and what's the effects on species, but I also think how the estuary responds in some pretty extreme conditions related to low flows. I think from an operator standpoint, too, what we're finding is the level of coordination amongst reservoir operators and diverters along the river has had to be ratcheted up a notch. And I think that helps us, you know, the improved communications, whether it's amongst the agencies or amongst the project operators with the irrigators, has been significant, and we are able to understand each other's difficulties. And I think that's an element of this uncertainty that's also going to help us in the out years as we move forward. So that's a, you know, just it's a bit of a survival mechanism, particularly when you're out there with some of the irrigators. But we need to run a pretty tight type operation this year above all other years, and so that we can, you know, meet some of these really close tolerances that we're working with.
Other questions?
Come back to you.
And this is actually two things. One, you heard earlier the request from Roseville, Folsom, and San Juan Water District that they wanted the Bureau to provide an operations plan, I assume beyond November. Is that in the works? Is that planned for? Is it going to be an extension of this joint operations plan, which sounds to me like it's a very constructive way to go, but specifically, what is the Bureau planning beyond the end date on this current operations plan?
Well, I think obviously the first horizon is getting through the little bit of variation we have in hydrology. Between now, we'll have a new snow survey with some potential runoff information from May 1st. That still is showing a little bit of variation. I think how the runoff progresses. Again, here's an example of, we're at a fairly extreme example of low snowpack. And how much of that can you really count on getting into Folsom as an example, or Oroville. So we're going to have to work through that, manage our way through the end of September. And I think the first hit will be, what if we have a dry fall? Reclamation certainly stands ready to kind of project out, and Folsom is an interesting example about how we see releases there as well as where lake levels are. We have some contingency plans. Obviously, the further you get out in time, the more uncertainty you have about, well, which extreme hydrology are you going to plan for? Is it a 90% exceedance? Is it a 99% exceedance? Is it, 1977 minus some? And at some point, you do need to think about what your priorities are system-wide when it gets so dry. And those will be tough decisions, and it's only as your plan then would only be as useful as your set of assumptions and how those priorities play out. And we could spend a lot of time, arguing about 18 months from now, what's the right release to make at Nimbus, when the example that we had this year with a small close flow of a couple thousand acre feet, for the realization that steelhead, we probably need to move those fish out. They're there, the monitoring suggested that. So the monitoring can pop up, and you're not going to see that kind of resolution over an 18-month period. So these exercises are good to kind of think through what those rough spots are and the things that we need to hit as things progress. Obviously, power planning is something that we've had a lot of requests about. Gee, can we go longer than 12 months, perhaps? And, we're certainly willing to do that. And I think that we just need to put it into the right hierarchy in terms of, where does that place us versus what we need to decide over the next, 3, 6, 9 months period. So, we're prepared to work with any of our contractors about some of those longer term questions. But the longer we get and the more severe the assumptions are, the more that some other dynamics of system-wide, some of our discussions back in January were, how much water do we have for just drinking water for, cities and for human consumption? How small is that? And, I think that this year there were certain needs that were being met by stored water, let's say south part of the state. You probably can't assume on that level of supply being available in storage in the south next year, and I think that's where a dynamic we need to play into this. So a bigger model comes into play. So you can do an Oroville plan and a Folsom plan and a Shasta plan, but pretty soon they all meld into one plan if you have a severe enough situation.
Well, along those lines, and I think I recall that over the last 10 years, there really only been 3 years that were considered normal or above. Is that right, John? I think anyway, it's close to that. Over the last 10 years, we've had more below normal, and of course this is the extraordinary year, but we haven't had a lot of rain over the last 10 years. And operating year to year, when you have that kind of variability that we're starting to see, calls strongly into question whether we should be planning year to year. We really, we're dealing with storage. We're dealing with a lot of we're inheriting in the current year activities that were taken in the past couple of years, and so it just is. Where are you in your thinking about expanding the time frame that you plan for, realizing that if we run into the opposite over the next 10 years, that would be great, but the likelihood, but we can deal with a lot of water. It's hard to deal with very little water, and so where are we on this longer time frame that Ron mentioned, and I assume all of you are thinking about it?
Well, I guess I can start. So, yeah, we do have 2 year types that are referred to as above normal and below normal. I think really, the only thing would be normal for California hydrology is that it's highly variable. So I would probably call them below average and above average rather than using the term normal. But you're absolutely right. I mean, in that, I presented that before the board before, California is unique in its variability from year to year. And so that's what creates a real challenge in the planning and management process. So, but typically built into our planning process is the fact that we always assume the conservative assumption on the hydrology. So for starters, that's always the basis for our planning. We're assuming maybe not the worst, but it's a pretty bad scenario. The question is, to what degree of risk do you operate to? And if you operate to what you think is the worst, there can always be something worse than that. So it's kind of what is the reasonable level of conservatism, I think, is kind of the ongoing struggle, I think, you have in the planning process. Because you don't want to completely cripple your system by assuming epic drought will occur in every year. But you need to have management actions in place to deal with those types of contingencies. And I think what we've seen is a lot of those management activities taking place this year. So I think this is exactly the kind of thing. When we were in January, we were looking at all of these management actions. We don't like to do it, but there's only so many scenarios that you can assume in your modeling when you set up your regulatory regime. We don't want to have to dam up channels in the delta, but those are the types of actions that you need to deal with the kind of picture that we were looking at in January, which, as you noted from the graphic, was far below anything we had ever seen before. How do you plan for something like that? But if you've got contingencies to respond to it, I think that's the important thing.
I think Garwin touched a little bit on this when we were doing and working the consultation and the annual reviews within thinking about cold water pool management at Shasta and winter run Chinook salmon. We've been thinking about 2-3 years of having to deal with that. Obviously, not all our reservoirs are quite sized the same way in terms of the size of the storage versus the potential runoff from each one. Folsom, that we've been talking about, is a fairly small reservoir given the average annual runoff that you would experience. At the other extreme for reclamation would be New Melones, which we take and try to achieve a much more longer-term view as to how we manage the storage there, because the refill takes so long. It's very large versus the size of the runoff that would come into the reservoir. Shasta is probably more in between. So you typically think about it in a 2-3 year scenario and manage through that. You don't throw all your water at everything in a particular year and take yourself down the dead pool, obviously. But at the same time, you don't try to keep up to maximum flood pool carryover just in case you go into a 3-year drought. And as John said, cripple yourself economically to do such a thing. So I think we learn as we go through. We get into a sequence of dry years. Human nature has been to kind of plan that way. I got to tell you, some times where we've had several, flood years over a course of 5, then you start taking a little different approach to some of this. But I do think we're learning as we go through, and I think some of the species interaction concerns and getting additional information are very important. But at Shasta, we've been trying to take a measured approach, and part of this isn't so much this year, what do you do in terms of carrying over? The question is, what do you do for winter run Chinook temperature management this year versus carrying a little bit over. And I think a lot of times we say, gee, I'm going to put, if I got cold water at Shasta, I'm going to use that this season as best as I can to protect those fish I've got in the river now. Because I do have a potential to recover from that. You know, rather than say, gee, I'm going to save 100,000 acre foot of that for next year. If that hampers my cold water pool management, I'm probably not going to do it. But we have these kinds of discussions all the time. But there's a lot of that, do something now if you've got it, because it's at a premium, because you got that uncertainty, as John pointed out. California's got some pretty significant swings, and yeah, we might be here 2 years from now talking about, you know, how come you guys, you know, kept some, you know, didn't have a bigger hole.
Great. You don't all have to answer every question, but I want to give you the opportunity to.
Yeah, I already turned my mic on.
You did. You're ready. So just letting you know.
I just have a brief comment.
Go ahead.
This is a very prudent thing for us to all keep reminding ourselves that we need to do. The climate is changing, and we need to be prepared for what may come in the future. It may not just be changes in levels of precipitation or air temperatures or sea surface elevation. There may also be changes in the frequency of drought, and we need to continue to stay apprised of the state of science on that, because it clearly is something that the agencies need to deal with.
So I have quite a few questions, and I'm going to try to go a little quicker. Please don't feel that you all have to answer each question. So on this issue, we were just talking about carryover, use it now, use it later, some sort of a balance. I'd like to hear more about the biological opinion and the contingency plan. I think if I heard you, Garwin, about requirements for 1.9, but if that can't be met, there would have to be contingency plans. What exactly is included in the biological opinion regarding factors for contingency plans?
You're challenging my memory here. So we have in our Shasta operations, part of the RPA, there's a requirement for a February forecast at the 90% exceedance. And the forecast includes what kind of temperature compliance can be met throughout the season, Clear Creek, Airport Road, down to Balls Ferry and Bend Bridge, what the projected end of September storage would be at the 90%. For this year, we're looking at like dead pull in February. So part of the exception within that is if Clear Creek temperature compliance point is not met at IGO, or 1.9 million acre feet at Shasta cannot be met end of September, then Reclamation and DWR shall develop by February 28th a contingency plan. Part of the requirements is, so operationally, Reclamation tries to target Wilkins Slough at 5,000 CFS. One of the requirements is no greater than 4,000 at Wilkins Slough. There's other things, for example, invite the board and board staff to take a look at delta requirements. So that's part of this contingency plan that we've been using as terminology for January, February, and then the drought operations plan in April is what requirements can be flexible, loosen requirements, whatever the terminology is, all around the system. Shasta being the most important for winter run, one of the requirements is that if delta requirements need increased releases from reservoirs, then increase those releases starting at Nimbus or Folsom and Oroville first, for two reasons. One, because winter run, their sole existence is hanging on Shasta, so we want to make sure there's enough water in Shasta. And the other is the travel time. We mentioned 5 days at Shasta compared to 3 or 2 at Oroville and Folsom. And then beyond that, I don't think we anticipated, even though I mentioned that during the development of the drought biological opinion, what does 3 years of drought really mean? If we really have no water, what are we going to do? So, you know, over the last 6 months, we're talking about that, rolling up our sleeves, and minus February and March, what can we do? Sacrifices around the system for fish, for people, for farmers, and wherever, not to target anybody. But what would, for example, winter run do if we have less outflow? is that a cost that would make sense for Winter Run compared to other things like increasing Keswick releases for outflow? And then we have this issue of Shasta storage.
Okay, and then I think the discussion on monitoring was already very thorough, but just one quick question on that regarding pulse flows. So they're probably shorter than what you would like for some of for the fishery agencies, and maybe not as intense. So what can you do to monitor the effectiveness of limited pulse flows as opposed to what you might normally do?
Well, I think part of it is in the enhanced, particularly Sacramento system monitoring that was done relative to the Delta Cross channel gates. And so we did a pretty good job of, I think, characterizing the response of salmonids in the Sacramento system to the rain pulses that occurred in that system and how the fish responded and moved out of the system. And I think for the most part they came with the pulses and they continue to trickle out, but they came primarily when those bigger pulses came through the system. And that also allowed in the planning process to look at how you would deal with increasing operations to take advantage, as long as you were meeting the water quality standards, to allow some level of export out of the system, and do it in a way combined with salvage monitoring, keeping in mind that all of the triggers in the biological opinion for salvage density at the facilities remained in place to operate as a backstop on any increased take that might occur. So I think, you know, the combination of those things allowed us to understand how that worked. We also had ongoing monitoring that's normally done to track the distribution and relative abundance of delta smelt and longfin smelt, so that we could gauge where they were relative to the facilities and the level of risk there and how they distributed themselves in the system.
Okay.
Well, can I interrupt just a second? What about the San Joaquin?
The pulse out of San Joaquin. There's two pulses. One is the Stanislaus. Appendix 2E requires specific flows for specific days of each year, depending on water year type. And through an adjustment to the RPA, NIMS provided for the Stanislaus operations group to shape the pulses, depending on timing, duration, and magnitude, provided that the volume of water is the same. For this year, they came up with a pulse out of the Stanislaus, and then through the RT-DOT and the DOT operations team, we asked them to revisit that pulse in consideration of the Vernalis pulse. So that pulse was subsequently reshaped. We talked about the 3300 and 1500. So that block of water, the agreement and commitment was the block of water out of the Stanislaus would be the same. And during the first 15 or 16 days of Vernalis, if that target was not met, then the pulse through the stand would be reshaped to compensate for that. So that's what's happening now. The intention was the 3300 and the 15. And I think what was realized on the San Joaquin was somewhere around 3,100, now balanced with about 2,000 to make up for that. And there's actually two types of pulses. One is the natural pulse through precipitation. The other is increased releases out of the reservoirs. On Clear Creek, through the RPA, there's a required pulse flow for spring run attraction. And through the RT-DOT, we evaluated that need and request in consideration of water. So that was met, and there, I don't know if it was actually done, but each year before and after Clear Creek pulse flows, there's snorkel surveys to determine the effectiveness of those pulses. And on the American River, I mentioned earlier that for Winter Run, we have in place monitoring of the reds on the Sacramento River. For the American River, the Water Forum contracted out to do the exact same thing. And throughout this year, we've been evaluating what the eggs feel, what they, as far as the water quality and temperature throughout that season, and specifically during those pulses.
On the Merced as well? Merced?
Well, I think there probably isn't the same level of monitoring on the Merced, although there is a level of monitoring that's conducted. I think in the Merced it was a matter of there wasn't or very little water available in the reservoir, and it was more a case of taking an action to generate a pulse to get fish out of the Merced before conditions deteriorated to the point where there wouldn't be suitable habitat. So that was kind of an emergency situation from that perspective.
Okay.
I was just going to add, there's some acoustic tag studies going on in the Delta at the same time. So you see a lot of individual studies going on, and I think part of the work after the fact here is in the whole monitoring regime is to piece that together and see what it tells us in terms of the value of pulses in a very dry landscape, I think, versus pulses in a very wet regime. I think would be very interesting to see survivorship and returns.
Right.
I think one other thing that's going to come out of this is what was put forward in the water action plan relative to 21st century technology, particularly for salmon and that kind of thing. And the department and National Marine Fisheries Service will be working between now and I think August or early in the fall to start to identify how to improve the monitoring system and the technologies that are applied to that so we can do a better job in real time.
Okay. Switching to a question on water supply, this is for Ron and anyone else that wants to jump in here on the exchange contractor and Friant allocation, or I guess not allocation, but delivery amounts, and sort of the status on that and the interplay with the COA. And also have a question relative to refuge water supplies and how these remaining discussions are impacting the refuge water supply south of Delta.
I'd be more than happy to let anyone else jump in on that set there. We are currently in the throes of trying to work through basically the drought operations plan, understanding interactions of some operations between the state and federal project as it relates to Delta, because all of those are going to come into play with basically south of Delta refuges and how much water is available for exchange contracts from the Delta side of this. I think at this time, particularly with a 90% exceedance hydrology, some water from the Friant system would be required to help meet the 75% level for the exchange contracts, which are called for as a result of the critical year shortage for shafts to inflow. At this point, we're still trying to see if we have enough water between those two sources to get to the 75%. There's been some improvement through time, but I don't know that we're quite there, particularly with that drier hydrology. Reclamation, as we stand right now, we are looking at trying to keep some parity between south of Delta refuges and the quantity for the exchange contract. So if in this analysis, as we go through the summer, and I'm just hypothetically, if the exchange contractors got roughly 60% of their supply for the summer, reclamation would try to make every effort to get 60% to refuges south of Delta, at least level 2. That's where we are right now. As hydrology changes and our interactions with the Department of Water Resources on their operations, a lot of this is going to come into play as to how San Luis will be operated and sharing of supplies in the Delta over the summer. And I think when you mentioned COA, I think that's an important piece. Because we have some COA dynamics that are in play, particularly given the actions we're taking to help San Joaquin River salmonids There's some preferential pumping that's going on at Jones Pumping Plant, so that we can keep and maintain a little bit lower export at the Banks facility, because for San Joaquin River fish, for whatever reason, the per acre foot salvage is higher at Skinner than it is at the Tracy Fish Screen facility. For whatever reason, I can't tell you why, but because of that dynamic, as a way to help protect a little better those fish, we're pumping more at the Jones Pumping Plant. That creates an imbalance of COA accounting that we're working with the Department of Wild Resources as to when they need that paid back, and can we use that in this whole dynamic of what can we make available for exchange contractors and other CVP supplies. You know, acutely aware of the circumstances within the Friant system about what a quote call in the river could do, and right now it's not looking particularly good there, given the amount of water limited supplies we can make available from the Delta. And with this 90% hydrology, as we've been working with it, there could be a situation, there's very minimal amount of water available for the Friant system. And that has some acute problems associated with trees on that side of the valley. And we, at the same time, have a 0% allocation to ag water surface on the west side. And I hear a lot of the same types of concerns about almond groves as I hear about orange groves. And so Reclamation is trying to figure out how best to leverage all of its resources. And you know, to John's credit, he listens patiently to some ideas that we have on the CVP side. But those also ripple into the dynamics of the Kern Water Agency and availability of supplies for them, and what flexibilities a metropolitan water district may or may not have. So this is a complicated set of dynamics. You know, for the drought operations plan, we spent a lot of time in a lot of our discussion today about Sac River, Delta standards, how those work out. Those all have to settle down to some degree so that we can then define south of Delta San Luis operations and do this balancing. So we're still in the throes of this. There is still a little bit of a hope. I still see some variation between a 90% and a 50% exceedance forecast on the upper San Joaquin River into Millerton. And that's a quantity of water that may allow us to do a little more in terms of stretching that supply. But it's going to be a stretch, and there is a gradation of opinions, both legally in terms of contract interpretations as to who gets what. And we're trying to sort out that with the various parties as well. So it's not an easy situation, and you know, we've come a long ways just in the last 10 days on this issue, but we still got a ways to go.
Okay.
That's not throwing a number out there and say,
Yes.
I think it's X.
Oh, I didn't expect that.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So last question has to do with flexibility with respect to transfers, garter snake issues, and also CVPIA restrictions on amount of water that can be moved. I'm not going to be able to articulate this quite right, but I understand that there might be some restrictions also through CVPIA on transfers. So if anyone could comment on the ability to provide flexibility in those two areas.
Well, I think as Diane Riddle discussed earlier, or the previous staff presentation, there's a transfers work group that's focused on trying to address those issues and identifying transfers. The issue that may be emerging is the desire to make transfers outside of the transfer window, and how that could be accommodated, particularly as it relates to in-delta operations as much as upstream considerations. So I think all of that has full engagement of the fishery or fish and wildlife agencies, as well as the operating agencies, to figure out how to make those kinds of things work as best as possible.
Good
I
question.
think I'll speak up a little bit from the water operations side of this. Obviously, transfers are going to be a big part of trying to meet various supplies, particularly from groups of settlement contractors that have a bit more water to areas that don't, have very little to no allocations this year. This is one that the operators are a little bit in a middle position, and at one time we certainly want to get who are typically our customer base some water in a very dire situation. We have to have an eye towards that those transfers are, quote, real water and aren't undermining some other work that we're trying to do with the project. So, and we have to do that quickly and fairly and efficiently. So we are really geared up to do this. And probably no one has a lot of sensitivity to any red tape associated with some of this work. So we're trying to find as many ways to make sure that we got real tangible supplies and figure out what the conveyance limitations of those may be. This may be Delta. This may be just how do you get water from Sac Valley to, Orange Grove in Tulare County. There's a lot of moving parts there. Some of it's regulatory in nature, and some of it's just good old-fashioned conveyance and what kind of exchanges can folks do. So we've got a lot of creative ideas that have been, put before us, and we just got to figure out, make sure there's no strings attached to some of those that make it difficult for other parties. So the projects are kind of being looked at to make this stuff work, and at the same time, make sure other interests aren't being adversely eroded while those things are going on. Right. And so it's not easy. So almost every deal has a detractor that says, well, wait a second, I'm worried that under certain circumstances could cut into my ability to have access to water, or the timing, or a lot of this is risk management, and we're doing a lot of that type of thing at the same time. So bear with us. We're still kind of early in this part of the process, and we will continue to work with let me put this, with the coordination and the setting up of relationships that we've seen through January, February, March, into April will serve us well as we go into the spring and summer on some of these transfer issues. And that's probably the bumper sticker for that. But transfers will be somewhat challenging just to make sure that they're meeting their intended purposes.
That's my question now.
Yes, all yours.
Thank you. Those were excellent questions. And thank you for your presentations. I especially appreciate hearing from the fishery agencies and how very complicated, well, for everyone, this entire process has been. I'll go back to the question I asked Ms. Riddle earlier today in terms of the impacts to water quality in fisheries as a result of some of these changes. Just given the unprecedented nature of these conditions, given the complexity of all the factors you are considering, given the uncertainty associated with current data as well as the monitoring that's ongoing, what level of comfort or uncertainty or certainty could you or any of us have in terms of the outcome of these planning and operational decisions? And without that certainty, how could any of us reasonably make a determination that these impacts are not unreasonable or acceptable, as the case may be?
Nobody wants to take it on.
Well, that is the question that is being addressed to all of us, given the various petitions, protests, and other matters which have brought us here today.
Well, I'll talk in general sense as far as the monitoring for winter run. So through the Delta operations for salmonids and sturgeon, that team meets every week, and we take a hard look at, specifically for winter run, but we look at winter run, spring run, steelhead, green sturgeon, and also include fall run in the main stem Sacramento River, all the way down to the Delta. We took a look at salvage, exports, OMR, just the whole system. For one around, I mentioned increased monitoring associated with DCC, gate opening and closing, and also where the fish are in the system. So earlier this year, through the DOS, the question's been asked, where are the fish? When we're talking 4 million winter run, 1 million winter run, well, how many are there? So we have questions like that, and where are they? At the risk of entrainment through the DCC and, its associated stressors. There's biweekly monitoring or reporting out through Red Bluff Diversion Dam. We have a juvenile production estimate that estimates the number of winter run in the delta, and that's how we calculate the instill take statement or instill take limit for winter run. But that's the million-dollar question: is where are they, and what's the effect of the drought and operations? And we've had a lot of discussion through the DOS, and the interagency biologists within DOS trying to determine the location and distribution. For this year, there was an estimate of 4 million winter run at Red Bluff. Through the rotary screw traps that Fish and Wildlife Service monitors, we've seen, I think it's between 1 and 3 million. So why haven't we seen 4 million? That was the estimate. So if it is 4 million, then are they at Red Bluff? Did they make it down to the delta? What we've seen is, because throughout the water year, we've seen, low flows, clear water. Did the monitoring accurately reflect the distribution of winter run coming down the Sacramento? Because of the low flow and lack of turbidity, did the winter run avoid the traps? We can't confirm a negative, so did they bypass all the monitoring stations, or are they just not there? So those are the very issues that we're grappling with. Fortunately for us, we only have to deal with the ESA and the fish. So for us, we operate conservative for the benefit of the species. Of course, it has to make sense. So that's our operating paradigm as we try to manage for the species.
Yeah, I wish I could offer you an assurance that the outcome will absolutely be something in, some outcome, some particular outcome if a particular management regime is chosen. But unfortunately, I don't think we can ever be absolutely sure of what the outcome's going to be in circumstances.
Give me your 51% sure.
Yeah, well, maybe at the 51% level, but we're in our ongoing review of water operations and effects on delta smelt, which I think is one of the major issues that we've had to grapple with. We have had to distinguish between the effects of the drought, the natural hydrologic drought that's occurring, and the effects on top of that, the potential effects of water project operations. And as I said before, droughts are hard on species, and we expect that we're going to get a low number when we get the annual index for delta smelt this year. That's just a consequence of the way things work for that species. We have concurred with water project operations with the proviso that we have not yet concurred with the drought barriers in scenario that's in the drought operations plan, only the drought barriers out scenario. And we based that concurrence on our conclusion that water operations don't create any additional adverse effects beyond what we analyzed when we issued the biological opinion back in 2008. The best that we can tell you is that our analyses aren't finding, with respect to drought barrier out operations, aren't finding anything significantly attributable to water project operations that wouldn't already have been happening in these drought circumstances. It's a thin read sometimes, especially when conditions are as strange as they are this year, but that's the basis that we've had to operate on with regard to our concurrences.
So I think Garwin and Mike have kind of pointed out the situation that's teasing out the difference between operations and what would be happening anyway in these dry conditions. I think, when we talk about the changes that are made to the water quality standards relative to outflow, the differences that we're talking about are relatively minor between what we would experience in a critically dry year versus what we would see in a wet year, and that those are conditions that aren't conducive to the fish doing well in the system. Based on our historical understanding. And I think, so consequently, there's been a lot of focus on monitoring, as I mentioned previously, relative to the effect of the operations themselves on direct take or quantifiable take, and the risk that those operations pose to the fish in the system, particularly as they're distributed. And what we've seen this year is that most of the distributions have been in the Sacramento or in the confluence or into Sassoon, depending on outflow, as opposed to the central and south deltas, where we've seen relatively minor salvage, and particularly in the kind of year that the way it started for something like longfin, we would have expected a potentially more significant effect, particularly if operations had been high, but operations were low, so consequently the effects weren't as significant as they would have been in, let's say, a less critical situation where operations would have been in a more normal phase and the fish would have been more potentially subject to entrainment into the South Delta.
Thank you. I recognize that was a difficult question and appreciate your attempts.
Yeah, I want to support the question, because when you asked it before the panel, I look at the numbers, and so I automatically, as a decision-making role, want to see that a monitoring network is in place and that you all have the confidence that you're collecting information, so that when we look back on, and if we had to rely on the 2,000 CFS standard through the fall versus a 3,000, if there was any effects that were discernible, because that's a lot of water that's not going to go through pursuant to D1641. And I think the magnifying glass is on for that decision. Thank you.
Other questions? Well, thank you all. I hope you'll be able to come back after lunch. I apologize we did not take the mid-morning break, which usually I adhere to, but it seemed best to just keep going. We will take a lunch break now because it would be unfair not to. And I would like to ask that everybody come back at 1 o'clock, and would appreciate it if you all could come back as well, because we'll probably have questions after hearing from the public. So thanks very much, and we'll see you all at 1 o'clock. Okay, so the car needs an alternator.
Oh, so it's okay?
Well, it's okay for an alternator. I think it has bigger problems, but I sent him to a place that Yelp said did Volvos that was close by. But it's not really a Volvo-like dealership, so he didn't want to push the river.
So you
So
just
now
abandoned Warner right there?
I did. Well, he's got his computer. Yeah, I did. I actually abandoned him in the middle